be studying from Matthew 24 this morning, and you can probably spend most of your time there, although I'll be jumping around with a bunch of things, and you might wonder why Matthew 24? Well, Matthew 24 is probably one of the most misunderstood chapters in the entire New Testament because of premillennialism and the idea that a rapture is going to take place and take everyone away, and then there's going to be 7 years of tribulation, and all this tribulation is described in Matthew 24, et cetera, and such. But the question is that true? Well, no, it's not. The idea of a 1,000-year reign has been around since the 2nd century, but Hal Lindsey in 1969, 1970 wrote a book called The Late Great Planet Earth, and that's when this thing really took off. And Hal Lindsey saw in the various scriptures, which he cobbled together from Daniel and from Revelations and from Matthew, the 24th chapter, he was able to see in Revelations that locusts were modern-day helicopters and scorpions were modern-day tanks. And that the formation of the EU in 1965 with 3 nations would ultimately turn into 10 nations, which would fulfill Revelations chapter whatever, I forget, where the dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns with 10 crowns. Unfortunately for him, the EU never had 10 nations. It's now said it stands at 27. So that didn't work out, and there's a number of other things that didn't work out we'll get into as well. But this has captured the imagination of the denominational world, and you have the Left Behind series, okay, where people, again, were supposedly everybody was raptured up and then they're left behind, and all this tribulation comes upon all these people for 7 years, just taken from Daniel and again, ripped out of context. And we won't have time to go into all that. But the point is that this has become a craze in our modern times, and in fact, when you talk to people in the denominations, they will talk more passionately about the rapture than about anything, and like look and point to various things and say, "See, this is pointing to the end times. This is it. This is the return of Christ. This is all going to happen. It's all talked about in Matthew 24." Well, is that what Matthew 24 is talking about? And the answer is no. So that's where the confusion comes from. And so we look at this and we have to remember that we never let the obscure define the plain. Now, when you look at Matthew 24, as we'll get into, there are some passages that are difficult for us to grasp, particularly as we read them in a cursory way. There's a lot of apocalyptic language. There is a lot of language that is that we're not used to seeing. There's a lot of plain language in it too, don't get me wrong. But there is some of that. But when we understand what this is about, then all of that has to fit into place. And you never let the plain get obscure, defined by what is obscure. If you don't understand this passage, and yet it is violated by what is plain over here, then your understanding of this obscure passage probably isn't right. But that's exactly what they've done, is they've taken obscure passages and then let those define what is very plain. So a little background concerning what we refer to as the Jewish Wars, which is taken from Josephus. And we'll get into Josephus in a little bit here too. But the Jewish Wars is really what this is all about. Now, the Jewish rebellion against Rome began in the year 66 AD and was ended in Masada in the year 73. And during that time, the total destruction and burning of Jerusalem occurred. There were only 3 fortresses left standing, and those were the fortresses that Rome had built, and that was the ones that Titus left standing so that they would know that Rome had destroyed Jerusalem. But it began in 66. Cestius Gallus was sent with Syrian legions to quell the rebellion, and he was ultimately ambushed and defeated in 67 AD. Now, that, of course, the rebels, the Jewish rebels, that okay, we can take on Rome. But Vespasian was sent with 4 legions of Roman army. And you have to understand that you didn't mess with the Roman army, okay? The Roman army was one that defeated the entire known world. And one of the reasons is they, at times, practiced what we would call, what it was called decimation. And if you showed cowardice in battle, what they would do is they would take and line you up in groups of 10. If you drew the short straw, death, meaning 10th, you drew the short straw, the other 9 would beat you to death. That was your command. So you didn't show cowardice in battle. So he had 4 Roman legions. And Vespasian began the conquest in Galilee, and this is where Josephus kind of comes in, because Josephus was a Jew who was of priestly descent. His wife claimed some royalty in some way. He was born in Jerusalem, but he was a general in the Jewish rebellion and fought in Galilee. And in the siege of Yodfat, which was a city that was besieged by Vespasian for 40 days, Josephus was part of that siege. And ultimately, the Jews lost 40,000 people in that siege. And the Roman army lost 1. Josephus was taken captive. Vespasian took a liking to him because Josephus said ultimately, according to the way he interpreted some things, that Vespasian would become Caesar. Vespasian did become Caesar and then ultimately freed Josephus. But there was a pause here in this action, so to speak, because there was problems back in Rome. And Vespasian was called back to Rome and ultimately made Caesar, but he sent his son Titus to finish out the rebellion. Now, when this all happened, refugees flooded into Jerusalem. And not only that, but Titus began his siege 3 days after the Passover. So Jerusalem was filled with people celebrating the Passover, refugees from Galilee that had come down and tried to seek refuge, and the city was overwhelmed with people. And 250,000 Jews died in the rebellion before Titus ever got to Jerusalem. And then when he got to Jerusalem, ultimately 1.1 million Jews died in the siege over a 5-month period. Another 96,000 were taken captive. Many of them were used to build the Roman Colosseum. But a siege that was exacerbated by infighting among the Jews themselves. And the destruction of the entire food supply was in Jerusalem was a result of that infighting. And what was so horrific about all of this is that the siege and destruction of Jerusalem was shocking to the entire Roman world. Now, it's hard for us to grasp. I'm throwing out a lot of things, a lot of numbers here, but it's hard for us to put this into perspective. But when you consider what happened to the Jews, about approximately 1.4 million people, when you consider the 250,000 and the 1.1 million and the other 96,000 that were taken into captivity, that 1.4 million, if something like that were to happen today, we live in a world of 8 billion people. 1.4 million represents what we would call Oklahoma City metro area, which extends from Chickasha to Shawnee, from Purcell to Guthrie, El Reno, Yukon, etc. That's 1.4 million people. Can you imagine 1.4 million people dying in a very short time span and it not having an effect on the entire world? What happened downtown with the Merle building shocked the world. In a world of 8 billion people, people would be stunned. The Roman Empire consisted at that time of approximately 100 million people. This was more than 1% of the entire population of the Roman Empire that died. And it was characterized by the murder, the starvation, cannibalism, desecration of Jews by Jews. Inside the city was horrific. But what is most important is you have to remember that this was a city that was the center of everything Jewish. It was chosen by God. It was the end of the entire Jewish economy. It was the end of the entire Jewish leadership. It was the end of the entire Jewish government. And most importantly, it was the end of the entire Jewish religious worship. It would never be the same again. It would shift from temple worship to what they call today rabbinic worship, because they don't have a temple. So, Josephus says, he places the blame where it was and where it should have been. And he says, for that it was the seditious temper of our own that destroyed it, and that they were the tyrants among the Jews who brought the Roman power upon us, who unwillingly attacked us and occasioned the burning of our holy temple. Titus Caesar, who destroyed it himself, is a witness, who during the entire war pitied the people who were kept under by the seditious, and did often voluntarily delay the taking of the city and allowed time to besiege in order to let the authors have opportunity for repentance. And that's kind of important as well. So let's begin our study here. We've got lots to go through. It really begins in Matthew, the 23rd chapter. You remember, this culminates the 7 woes that Jesus was talking about with the Jews. Remember, he said, woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, and then he would go on and excoriate them. And then he says in verse 34, therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly, I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Now, I want you to keep that in mind. This will come upon this generation. This will come upon your contemporaries. That's the way that is used. It's your contemporaries. This is contemporaneous with you. It's this generation, because this will become important in just a moment. So keep that in mind, that he's just said all these things will come upon you, this generation. And then he ends with, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills their prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not. He says, you've killed prophets. You've killed righteous blood, and I'm going to send you more prophets, and you're going to kill them too. And they did. And we'll see that. And he said, I just wanted to gather you. But you wouldn't have. And then he says something extremely important. See, your house is left to you desolate. Now, not a word we often use, but desolate means uninhabited, deserted, forsaken. He says your house will be deserted, uninhabited. So, chapter 24, verse 1, Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. Now, why do you think they said that? He just said it's going to be left to you, deserted, desolate, uninhabited, forsaken. And they point out him the buildings, and he answered them, you see all these? Do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Now, the temple was a magnificent structure. It covered 37 acres. I kind of like this up here. This shows a little football field here. It took 86 years to build, and it was completed less than 5 years before it be totally destroyed. Some of the stones were 40 feet by 12 feet by 12 feet. We don't even know how they moved them from the quarry. And they looked at this and they said, look at this. Jesus says not one stone will be left on another. This was a marvel of the ancient world. I mean, even Titus didn't want this destroyed. And Titus wasn't a believer in God. He didn't want this thing destroyed. It was incredible. And so when they walked down the steps and he said, don't one stone be left on another, you can imagine their shock, their dismay. What? How can this be? Titus, I'm not going to read all this because I simply don't have time. I'm going to go through this, but basically you can read it yourself. But Titus, when he found out that a fire had started in the temple, attempted to stop it. And he couldn't even stop his men, even after having some of them beat. Because, as it says down here, their passions were too hard for the regards they had for Caesar and the dread they had for him who forbade them, as was their hatred of the Jews. By the time they got to this point, they hated the Jews so bad, and what they were in this siege, they wouldn't even obey Titus. And the hope of plunder induced many to go on. We know that they actually dug up, according to Josephus, the foundations of the temple to get some of the gold that had melted down. It was utterly destroyed. What happened today? Muslim mosque sits on top of it. Dome of the Rock, the third most holy place according to the Muslim. Actually, there's two mosques there. There's another one over here. For 1900 years, the Jews couldn't step foot in this area. The 1967 Arab-Israeli War, they were able to allow to step foot in there as tourists, but still to this day, they can't pray if they go in there. And most of them won't go in there. They pray along the Wailing Wall, as it's called. It's down here. But it's flat. There's nothing there. You see trees going around it and such. That's what's left of their Jewish temple. It was truly the end of an age. This is the Arch of Titus built by Domitian for his brother Titus. And it celebrates his conquering of the Jews. In it, you have bas reliefs of them carrying out the menorah, the table of showbread, and the golden trumpets. So he sat on the Mount of Olives, and the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So he asked three questions there. Luke, in the parallel passage, there's two questions that he deals with. Teacher, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? It's very plain. When will these things be, And what will be their sign? Okay? So, where Matthew 24:34 ends, we're going to talk about that in just a second for a couple of minutes. That's where Luke ends. Okay? Past 34 is when Jesus deals with his second coming with Perusia, and we won't deal with that. So Luke tells us plainly, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? And we know that those parallel passages end at Matthew 24:34. This is important. Remember I said generation. Keep that in mind. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. If we understand this passage, then we understand everything prior to it. If we misunderstand this passage, then we misunderstand everything prior to it. And this is the problem with the premillennialists. People like Hal Lindsey who made bukus of money off of this misconstrued concept. What is the generation? This generation. Remember, he says, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Luke 21:7. Remember they said, when will these things be and what will be the sign if they're about to take place? And Luke in 21:32 says, this generation will not pass away until what? All these things have taken place. Well, one of the problems is that they try to misapply the idea of generation. Now, in doing so, they make it all in the future and all apply to Christ's second coming. Remember, according to them, all Christians are just going to be raptured away and they're not going to be here for the tribulation. Luke says, but watch yourselves lest your hearts be weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and cares of this life, and that day will come upon you suddenly like a trap, for it will come upon all who dwell on the face of the whole earth. But stay awake at all times, praying that you have the strength to escape all these things that are going to take place. You don't escape the second coming. So he's saying that pray that you have the strength to escape all these things that are going to take place. You don't escape the second coming. He's fixing to tell them all the things you need to know to escape the destruction of Jerusalem. It is not talking about his second coming. Now, one of the things they'll immediately point to is say, well, wait a second, it will come upon all who dwell on the face of the whole earth. Well, we need to understand something because this jumps out of us in several places. But this is a little bit of a translation issue. Because earth seldom, in the Greek, it can mean the earth, but it seldom in the Greek means the earth. It means the land. For all who will dwell on the face of the whole earth. That was as follows. The Greek word, gay, is translated land, region, country. The primary meaning is land in the geographical sense. Meaning, in Acts 19, gave them their land, gay, as an inheritance. The land of Zebulun, the land of Naphtali, gay, land. And the report of this went out to all that district. Same word. Now, when you look at it, it said over the face of the whole land, now it takes on a different meaning, doesn't it? This will take place over the whole land, over the entire land of the Jews. So when you, in verse 33, he's talking to them, when you see these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. He's speaking to his disciples, not a future generation. And so, thus it is when he says it will happen to this generation, it's going to happen then. Now, Let me back up just a minute, because there's two things that you'll hear. In fact, even R.C.H. Linsky, which I kind of like, even takes this position. He says that generation can mean race or people. Okay? And he's saying to them that the Jewish race will exist until these things take place. Well, that then becomes nonsensical. Jesus is telling them what's going to happen to the Jewish race, and then he's saying that it's going to stick around until the things I tell you happen to the Jewish race actually happens. That's a little redundant, isn't it? But the other problem that you have is in Matthew, generation is used 13 times, and it always means contemporaries. Always. And so the problem that Linsky has is he ends up jumping back and forth through the previous verses between the destruction of Jerusalem and the second coming, and you never know where he's going with it because it makes no sense. Secondly, Hal Lindsey made the great mistake in his book, The Great Planet Earth, of saying that a generation was 40 years, and that when they saw these things begin to take place, that Jesus Christ would return within 40 years. And he began that 40 years in 1948 when the nation of Israel was given back they fought for their freedom, and they were recognized as a nation again. Well, Jesus didn't come in 1988, did he? Well, he revised his book after 1988 and said a generation was 60 years. He didn't come in 2008 either. But he's still promoting it. He just keeps changing it. Okay? Doesn't work. He says, you see these things. He's talking about his disciples, and he's talking about their contemporaries. And if we understand that right, and we do, that generation, he's talking to them, this generation, why would he be talking about some future generation and saying, warning them to be able to avoid the things I'm fixing to tell you when these things take place? So we understand that Matthew 24:34, when he says generation, he's talking to them right there. Therefore, everything that we're fixing to discuss must take place within the generation of his disciples. Even the apocalyptic language that we'll talk about that is sometimes confusing. So, we begin. See to it that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will lead many astray. This is the first of 3 times that he's going to warn them, so this must be very important. He's going to warn them about false teachers. Josephus came to pass about a certain magician named Theudas, who persuaded a great many people. He said he was a prophet. He was ultimately killed. Read it, everything. Got to move on. He also talks about these impostors and deceivers persuaded the multitude to follow them into the wilderness and pretended that they would exhibit manifest wonders and signs that should be performed by the providence of God. Well, they were killed too. Didn't happen to them. But again, you can see even Josephus is recording various people claiming to be prophets, claiming to be Christ. Acts 5, we talk about the same one. Gamaliel talks about Theudas. In these days, Theudas rose up claiming to be somebody. He was killed, and his followers dispersed. After him, Judas the Galilean rose up. There were a number of people that popped up and claimed to be various things. 2 Corinthians 11:13. For such men are false apostles, deceitful workmen, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. This happened before the destruction of Jerusalem. Paul is writing about false apostles. Eusebius, in his ecclesiastical history, talking about the destruction of Jerusalem or prior to it, he says, thus were the miserable people won over at this time by impostors and false prophets. And they did not give heed nor give credit to the visions and signs that foretold the approaching desolation. Matthew 24:6. He says, you will hear wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. And you will hear that so many times by these various people. Oh, wars and rumors of wars. The end is about here. He says it's not. He says, you're going to hear about wars and rumors. There's been wars and rumors. We've had 2 world wars. There was wars. There was numerous wars. We don't have time to go through it all, but Josephus, the 20th chapter of his book, he talks about numerous wars that were engaged in by the Romans because there were numerous rebellions and numerous seditions, and they continued their drive toward world domination up into Gaul, up into in Spain, up into what we term Britain today. There were constantly things that they were dealing with. There was constant rumors of wars. He said, but that isn't it. There's more. You need to be paying attention to what I'm telling you because you need to be prepared. He says, for nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdoms, but there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginnings of birth pains. And one of them, named Agabus, stood up and foretold by the Spirit that there would be a great famine over all the world. Again, this is another one of those words that we have to be careful with because we use that term again as the world. He's not saying that a famine took place over all the world. He's talking about over the Roman world, over it's used, and we'll see that in just a few moments, and point that out to you from some other scriptures. But he said a great famine over the world. He said a great famine would take place. He said there will be famines and earthquakes. And so the disciples determined every one according to his ability to send relief to the brothers living in Judea. And we read about that by the Apostle Paul, and we read about it in Acts. We read about the results of that in 2 Corinthians. Tacitus records numerous earthquakes. He says houses were thrown down by frequent shocks of earthquakes. As the panic spread, all the weak were trodden down in the hurry and confusion of the crowd. Then he talks about the famine. Now Claudius was even drove to a corner of the forum and had to use soldiers to get himself out. He said it is not the end, but it is the very beginning of birth pains. And I love what John Criswell, how he phrased this in his commentary. So there will be pain as Christianity emerges victorious from the womb of Judaism. I think that is such an apt description of what we're talking about here. He said there would be pain as in childbirth, and that certainly was the case. He says, then they will deliver you. He's talking to his disciples here. They will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death. And you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Remember in chapter 23, we read there the last part of it where he says, I will send to you prophets, and you will scourge them, and you will kill them, and you will drive them out of your cities. We read about that, and as we've gone through the book of Acts, we've seen that over and over again. We read about how Paul, how he was beat, how he was stoned, how literally the Jews would chase him from one city and drive him out, and then follow into the next city and stir up the people against him. Everywhere we went, we read about it, and virtually every one of the New Testament epistles talks about Judaizing teachers coming in and twisting things and presenting problems for the church. That's going to end. That's going to end in 70 AD. Now, will there be other persecution, be later persecutions from the Roman Empire? Yes, but not like this. This is going to end in 70 AD. Christianity, as he says, will emerge from the womb of Judaism. Peter, Paul, James, and James the Less were all put to death before the destruction of Jerusalem. He says in verse 10 through 12 of 24, and then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. Did that happen? Yes. Acts 20. I know that after my departure, fierce wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock, and from among your own selves will arise men speaking twisted things to draw away the disciples after them. 1 Timothy, now the Spirit expressly says that in later times some will depart from the faith by devoting themselves to deceitful spirits and teachings of demons. 2 Peter 2:1, false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you who will secretly bring in destructive heresies. These are horrible things. And yet, Jesus said that's going to take place. And it did, as we just see here. In Josephus, he says, now there was a great number of false prophets suborned by the tyrants to impose upon the people, who denounced this to them that they should wait for deliverance from God. And this was in order to keep them from deserting. Thus were the miserable people persuaded by these deceivers. So, they had to keep them in Jerusalem. They didn't want people deserting to the Romans. Remember, Josephus said Titus gave him time. He didn't want this to happen to him. But they made sure their people didn't desert by using false prophets. He says, the one who endures till the end will be saved. Certainly a great promise to those at that time. And then he says, and this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed through the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come. And, you know, what you find in cobbling together with these various premillennialists that say, well, this is going to happen in the future. It already has happened. He said, well, the world's not been Christianity not been preached to the world. Well, number one, we have to again understand what the world says. In those days, the pre-Roman Caesar Augustus said all the world should be registered. This isn't this world, the Roman world. However, even with that being said, the scriptures are plain when it talks about the gospel being preached to the world. I thank God through Jesus Christ for all of you because your faith is proclaimed in all the world. Colossians 1:5-6, all these again before the destruction of Jerusalem. Which has come to you as indeed in the whole world it is bearing fruit and increasing. Colossians 1:23, if indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel which you have heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, of which I, Paul, became a minister. This is all before the destruction of Jerusalem. He said the gospel will be preached to all the world. It was preached to all the world. And then the end will come. What end? The end of the Jewish economy. Matthew 24:15-21. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight may not be in winter on a Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation such as not been from the beginning of the world until now, and no, will never be. There's a lot to unpack here. Now, you will hear them say the abomination of desolation. What is the abomination of desolation? It's really easy. Luke tells us plainly, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then you know its desolation has come near. He said it. What's the abomination of desolation? Jerusalem is surrounded by armies. And he says, he repeats the same thing as Matthew. And he says, for there will be great distress upon the earth, again, upon the land, that's what that word is, and wrath against this people. So, Now that we know what the abomination of desolation is, it's not some future event in which the temple is rebuilt and the Antichrist or whatever puts something inside there and all that kind of stuff that they come up with. It is Jerusalem being surrounded by the armies. And it says, so now in Josephus, he says, Titus's banks were advanced in a great way. Notwithstanding, his soldiers had been very much distressed from the wall. He then sent out a party of horsemen in order that they should lay ambushes. And he says here, that they captured various people going out looking for food and crucified them. And when the multitude was so great that room was wanting for the crosses, and crosses wanting for the bodies. We're talking tribulation here, folks. I can't describe what Josephus describes goes on in the city. We have children in this audience. There was so much awful things that went on in the city. The famine, the murder, the death, and as they begin to, the bodies begin to accumulate, they even quit burying them and they tossed them over the walls. It got so bad, read this if you want, it got so bad that when Titus, in going in his rounds along the valley, saw them full of dead bodies and the thick putrefaction of running about them, he gave a groan and spreading out his hands to heaven, called God to witness that this was not his doing. And such was the sad case of the city itself. Now remember, he said, don't go back down and get anything. If this is talking about the second coming of Christ, what do you mean go back? Pray that he doesn't come on the Sabbath? Why would you do that? Well, the destruction of Jerusalem, the last thing you want to do is have to flee on the Sabbath, and the Jews go, no, you can't do that. You can't walk any more than a mile. Sorry. Pray that you're not nursing or have little children. What's that got to do with the second coming of Christ? It has everything to do with being able to flee from the Romans, because when it happens quickly. So when you see Jerusalem surrounded by the armies, get out and get out now. Tribulation was about to take place. Josephus says in his preface, accordingly, it appears to me that the misfortunes of all men from the beginning of the world, if they be compared to these of the Jews, are not so considerable as they were. From the beginning of time, such has not been from the beginning of the world until now, and no will ever be. When Christ comes again, there's not going to be an ever be. So this all takes place then. For if those days had not been cut short, no human would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days won't be cut short. 960 of the Sicarii, which is just simply basically assassins, fled to Masada, which was a palace of Herod. And you can look at this as a fortress. They were safe there. The Roman army wasn't going to get them there. I mean, who can get into that? And why would the Roman army, after killing almost 1.4 million Jews, go after less than 1,000? Because they were Jews. No, the Roman army spent months building that, and then ran a siege machine up against it with a battering ram and broke through the walls. Everybody inside knew what was going to take place, so they all committed suicide with the exception of 2 women and 5 children. No, if God had not stopped it, there would have been no Jews left. And there were a lot of Jewish Christians. He said, for the sake of the elect. He then goes on to say, look, here's Christ do not believe it. More, I'm having to move quickly here. He says, don't fall for false prophets. This is the second time he said that. And it's, again, he says, in the last part here, for as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. And so people look at that and say, well, see, he's talking about the end time. Well, Jesus told the Sanhedrin, when the high priest said, are you the Christ? He said, you've said so, but I tell you from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. You see, that's strange words to us. It wasn't to them. And the high priest knew what he was saying. Matthew 24:48, he says, for where the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. We're going to come back to that piece in a moment. Vultures here is also eagles. Not coincidentally, the Roman standard was an eagle. But he says, the apocalyptic language, we're going to come back to the idea of coming with clouds of heaven here in a minute. But the apocalyptic language from here on provides some confusion for some people. And it's because they don't understand it. Now remember that this ended everything. It ended the leadership. It ended the Sanhedrin. It ended any kind of administrative powers over. It ended everything for the Jews. It ended their religious worship. It was truly the end of an age. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. Number one, he says, immediately. Not thousands of years later. Immediately. So what is he talking about here? Isaiah, concerning Edom. The host of heaven shall rot away, and the skies will roll up like a scroll. Did that literally happen back in the Old Testament? No. It's apocalyptic language. It's describing to the people what is happening in terms of the powers that be. Concerning Egypt, I will blot you out, and I will cover the heavens and make the stars dark. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give its light. Did the moon quit giving its light concerning Egypt? Yes, because they're in terms of their power and their leadership. Yes, it did, but not literally. He says in Matthew 26:64, you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. He's talking about coming in judgment. And that was the case in Isaiah, the 19th chapter. Concerning Egypt, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and comes to Egypt, and the idols of Egypt will tremble at its presence. He's coming in judgment, and that's what he told the high priest. You will see me coming in judgment. And that's what the destruction of Jerusalem was. Concerning Babylon, he says in Isaiah, for the stars of the heaven and their constellations will not give their light, and the sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. Did that literally happen? No. It's figurative language. So in Matthew 24:30, he says, then will appear the sign of the Son of Man, then all the tribes of the land will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with great power and glory. Remember, he says in Matthew 16:28, some of you standing here won't taste death until you see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. That's pretty plain. They wouldn't die. Well, Peter used the keys of the kingdom, Acts 2. Was Jesus physically there? No, he wasn't. But he was there spiritually. Now, in verse 24, verse 31, again, another verse that confuses people. He will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now, angels is a transliteration of a Greek word angelos. And it simply means messengers, and it can mean heavenly messengers or earthly messengers, as here in Luke 7:24, John's messengers, or in James 2:25, when it talks about Rahab the prostitute received the messengers. That is angelos. That is from the Greek from James, and that's the way it's translated in the Greek Septuagint. So, what is he talking about there when he says he will gather his elect from the four winds? with the destruction of Jerusalem, the word, the gospel spread at a rapid rate. And the elect were called from the four corners. At the second coming of Jesus Christ, he's not going to send angels out to gather people up. But his messengers did go out and call people to the gospel. And then he says, learn a lesson from the fig tree. He said, as soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. God is coming in judgment. Know that. And look at these signs. When Jesus comes in the second time, there's not going to be a bunch of signs that says he's coming, he's going to be here next week. But he's pointing to his disciples saying, pay attention, because when these things take place, you must flee to the mountains. Did they? Eusebius says, but the people of the church in Jerusalem had been commanded by revelations about safe to approve men there before the war to leave the city and to dwell in a certain town of Perea called Pella. And when those that believed in Christ had come thither from Jerusalem, then, as if the royal city of the Jews and the whole land of Judea was entirely destitute of holy men, the judgment of God at length overtook those who had committed such outrages against Christ and his apostles and totally destroyed that generation of impious men. I'm through. Thank you for your attention, and now let's move on. There's going to be a second judgment at the end of time when Christ comes again. And it's when we look at that and we look at the horrific things that took place in judgment against the people who shed the blood of prophets, who shed the blood of the apostles, who shed the blood of holy Christian men. There's going to be a judgment against all those who aren't Christians. When Christ comes again, he's going to judge the unrighteous. You do not want to be a part of that. If you're not a Christian this morning, you need to come believing and repenting, confessing, and being baptized in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of your sins. If you have sins or you need the prayers of the church for any reason, I ask that you come. Stand.